Welcome back to Close Up. There is intense competition right now to see which Democrat will emerge from the pack in the 1st Congressional District to challenge the frontrunner status of Stephanie Shaheen in September. One of the contenders in the mix is Heath Howard, a state representative from Stratford. Representative Howard, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Adam. I appreciate it.
So you did a great job at the end of last year, like bursting out onto the scene, getting some attention, translating that into some support. But how do you make this happen between now and September?
Yeah, well, we've already seen polling jumps. We're the second candidate to hit double digits in the polls. And I think that that's really important right now because when we're looking, especially even at the crosstabs, we're by far the leader with independents, people who didn't vote in previous elections. And also, you know, my experience as a state representative and, you know, the fact that I'm a Gen Z working class person really, I think, provides a unique perspective that people are looking for right now. The fact that I have experience that directly translates to the work that I would be doing in Washington. The fact that I can't hide from my record. The fact that people know exactly where I stand. And the fact that, as I said, we are leading significantly with those independents and people who didn't vote in previous elections.
How difficult is it as a challenger that you had that moment, you know, back in December, January? We saw that bump in the polls, and now we've seen no more polling since then. Hard to make the case to donors, volunteers. You're kind of flying blind at this point.
Well, yeah, but that's where we're, you know, still working on building up our volunteer base, getting people out on the doors, out clipboarding, tabling, going to events, talking to people, hosting house parties, you know, things all across the district. And I'm just so incredibly thankful for people who are stepping up right now, even when there isn't necessarily polling, as you said. But it's the fact that people are invigorated by our campaign and by our message.
Right now in that progressive lane, it appears you're kind of competing with Christian Urrutia. He picked up some endorsements that some people thought you were going to get. What happened there?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think that when we're looking at things, especially like these joint endorsements, there are a number of factors that are taken into consideration. And one of them, and I think that the most important factor, was fundraising. And, you know, I understand, you know, as I said, you know, I'm a working class person. I don't have millionaire friends. I'm not necessarily somebody who worked as a lobbyist for Airbnb making millions of dollars, you know. And it's things like that where people are looking at the real lived experience that I have and are saying, we want to go with you. And, you know, that's where we're still even picking up additional progressive groups and endorsements. I mean, I'm very proud to say that, you know, the graduate educators and employees union at the University of New Hampshire is supporting us. And that, I think, is really telling to the fact that everyday working people are supporting our campaign.
Yeah, and for progressives who aren't plugged into politics and may not pay attention to those endorsements, what is the case that you are making to progressives to say, hey, I'm your guy?
Yeah, well, as I've said, you know, it's the fact that I have the lived experience. It's the fact that I'm like everybody else, you know, and we saw that in the financial disclosures that, you know, WMUR put out a few weeks ago. And it's the fact that by far I'm the most average person in the field. And it's the fact that I'm nowhere near being a millionaire.
On policy, though, what makes you the progressive pick?
Well, on policy, I think that that's where, you know, we're definitely the progressive choice. The fact that we're standing up for a universal health care system that is not a tiered system. We're fighting for a single-tier system where everybody's treated the same. The fact that we're promoting universal free trade schools and tuition-free public universities. The fact that we're advocating for a ban on private equity and large corporations from entering the single-family housing market. And we're trying to raise the minimum wage to a livable wage. I think focusing on those issues, talking about union rights, overturning things like the Taft-Hartley Act so that we can ban, you know, so-called right to work, in my opinion, right to work for less legislation. And, you know, things like that where we can actually improve the actual quality of life for everyday people.
And you say some pretty bold things out there, too, on social media. I saw a post in early March where you said, defund the Pentagon. How does that work in practice? Does this mean take all the money away from the Department of Defense?
So when we're looking at the Pentagon, I mean, we have had a number of audits that they have not necessarily been able to pass. And this is a situation where I think that when we're looking at the Department of Defense in particular, it's our biggest money sink. That's where a lot of our tax dollars are going. And people are asking for transparency, for clarity, and for our government to act appropriately. And that's something where by actually going after the funding of the Department of Defense, we can actually hold them accountable. Because we've just seen so many blank checks being written. And we've had, you know, 5-star generals talk about how you could cut $1 billion from the Pentagon and nothing would change. And I think that that's exactly why people want us to see our government officials, our elected officials, going in and saying, this is not acceptable. You have to tell us where you're spending the money, why you need these funds, and how you're going to use them.
The practical side is one thing, the politics of totally another, right? How would you face that eventual, let's say you go down to Washington, you're like, we're going to cut the heck out of this Pentagon budget, and yet we have troops in harm's way in the Middle East. How would you deal with that sort of political incoming of people saying, hey, you're pulling the rug out from underneath the troops?
Yeah, well, I think that when we're looking at the situation and what's happening in the Middle East right now, especially, it comes down to the fact that we have this relationship with Israel that has really kind of furthered a lot of conflict in the Middle East. And we have to, really put a serious amount of consideration into how we continue that relationship. I think that we need to stop all arms sales to Israel. I think that we need to make sure that we put certain restrictions on aid and how that is actually provided to them. And I think that we need to make sure that we aren't necessarily engaging in these types of conflicts across the globe. We need to overturn the authorization for use of military force passed in 2001-2002 so that Congress is the one who decides, not the president.
You really stake your claim to being the most pro-Palestinian candidate in this Democratic primary. You were out there a lot before a lot of other candidates saying what's happening in Gaza is a genocide unequivocally. Your position on Israel is clear. I'm curious, what's your position on the folks who are in charge in Gaza? Where do you stand on Hamas?
Where I stand on Hamas, I think that we need to, respect the will of the Palestinian people. And we need to make sure that they have access to democracy. And it's the fact that I do think that we need to make sure that we allow the people to have self-determination. And that is very important to me. I think that, whether we're going to say, Hamas or Israel is going to be controlling the situation, I want the people to be controlling the situation and for them to make their choices as to how their government is going to move forward.
Other candidates sit here and they condemn Hamas. I didn't hear that just now, but do you take a position on Hamas?
I think that Hamas has definitely, there are a number of condemnable actions that they've taken. And, like any sort of government, I don't think that Hamas has a right to exist. I don't think Israel has a right to exist. I think that people have a right to exist, and I think that that is really the focus of what we need to be doing in terms of that humanitarian crisis.
That's an interesting question. That if people have a right to exist, if Hamas was able to achieve from the river to the sea, West Bank, Gaza, all of what is Israel currently, what would happen to the Jewish people living there?
Well, I think that we need to have a secular state. It's the fact that all people, regardless of religion, need to be treated the same, and that we should not have an apartheid state, and that's not something that the United States should be funding.
Speaking of treating people the same, you've been outspoken on transgender rights on the House floor. I think it was back in 2025. You made a direct correlation saying this is almost the same thing as what we saw in the Jim Crow South. Do you believe really that that is a co-equal level of discrimination?
Yeah, so I had a number of colleagues come up to me and ask me about this, and the comparison to Jim Crow. Some people took offense to that, and I do understand, but my concern is also the fact of how this legislation and law will be used. The fact that if we're going to ban people from restrooms, that is going to lead to a lot of potential issues where people who may be racist may go up to somebody who may be of black descent and say, I don't think that you belong in this restroom. And that would be legal for them to then remove that person from that restroom if they're the owner of that property under the laws that we're proposing in Concord. And I don't think that that's acceptable, because by opening up even an inch of discrimination, we are opening up the flood doors, and we're letting a bunch of different actions like that take place. And I don't think that that's acceptable, because no discrimination should be allowed ever.
Speaking to the politics of the moment now, though, 80% of the public disagrees with you on this. Democrats in Concord and trans advocates are using very harsh terms, though, like stochastic terrorism, bigotry, invoking Jim Crow. Your goal is to win elections and pass legislation, right?
Yep.
An 80-20 battle is an uphill battle for sure, but it's not unwinnable. So how do you convert that first malleable chunk of people to convert them to your cause if you're using terms that make them feel like you're judging them as a bigot or a racist?
Well, I'm not trying to, judge anyone. Again, I think that we need to make sure that we open up the dialogue, as you said, and we need to talk about how people should be living their lives as they see fit. I don't want to tell you how you should live your life, and I think that we need to make sure that, people in the trans community have the choice as to how they live their lives. It's not something that I think that the government should be involved in. It should be a choice between that individual and their doctor.
All right, Heath Howard, we've hit our time for the day. We appreciate it. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail, and hopefully it informs in the weeks ahead.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate it.